Tonight I want to talk with you about something that is very intimate and personal to all of us. It's our identity. Specifically, I want to talk about our identity as it's defined by the culture we live in. And that identity is our work identity. That's where we get our identity from. So, I think back to childhood and my first exposure to work defining our identity. And I remember being in a grade school classroom, and a teacher asked me, and some of you may remember this question, what does your dad do for a living? And I sat there and I thought about that for a moment. I didn't have words to describe what he did. I honestly didn't know what his title was. I didn't know the company he really worked for. I just knew he did something. So I blurted out, he's a salesman. He's a bag salesman. And I stopped and I had worried about trying to describe that to folks. Not only was I describing it properly, but what would they think of that? Now, you see, my dad has been a very successful entrepreneur. He sold many things. But at that point in time, all I could remember is what he did. So tonight, I want to talk a little bit about identity over time and how we have moved culturally through time and have built up our identity around our work. You know, we gain so much of our identity, again, through this work. And there's a theory called looking glass theory, some of you may have heard. We actually see ourselves by the most important person we know through their eyes. How do they view us? That's our identity. So I'm going to take us through a real quick, and I have some screens up here, I have a real quick history of where we've been and where we're going. And why I think this is important, because I think we're headed towards an identity crisis as a culture, specifically as it relates to work. The beginning of humanity, we were in a nomadic environment. We lived, we hunted, we ate together, and we moved from place to place, largely based upon where the herd was going. We followed. This was a very integrated way of life. It was a very simple way of life. And our identity came from an integrated part of our community. It simply was. If you fast forward a little bit, we'll move into the farm. And the farm was a place in time, in the agrarian period, where we figuratively and literally planted ourselves into homesteads. We defined an area, and we said, this is our area, this is our acreage. We lived and we worked there. We didn't have a lot of need for social interaction. We had a town to go to, we had neighbors to go to, but it was very integrated. We were very self-sustained. The seeds of our identity, of our modern identity, began at this point in time. And really, we started to look at what we have as starting to build an identity. How many acres do we have? How much quality and quantity of what we produced? That started to create my identity. Now, we take a real big fast-forward leap here to the factory and office-centric model. Now, what's really important about this is the first time where we started to separate where we live and where we work. And we started to shuffle back and forth between the two. This is really critical, because what it did is it started to separate also our social structures. I have friends around my home, my work. I have friends around my work. And rarely did those two intersect, right? And other things started to happen at this point in time. We started to define, what does a work week look like? How many hours are work time? How many are my time? We started to organize functionally at a large scale and started to build hierarchy in who we were. Our identities started to change. They were no longer integrated. They started to fracture. At one point in time, in the 90s, we had this promise that technology would save us, right? We were going to be home-centric. Remember this? Some of you might remember this. We could live and work at home. I didn't have to go into the office. I didn't have to go on that crazy commute. I could live and work at home. And I didn't have to deal with that coworker. That person I didn't really like or care for, I didn't have to deal with them anymore. I could just stay at home. And the only reason I needed to go out was for social reasons, right? So it was very simple. What's interesting is this was somewhat a revival of the farm work life. Everything was home, it was domestic, it was around where I lived and worked every day. The difference, again, was social. What is really interesting is this failed. And possibly because of some immature technology, but I believe that it failed because work at its very core is social. We need, we desire, we have to have other humans around us. This is the most important object in the world that we have as humans, is other humans. So that leaves us where we are today. We're in it, still remain in this office-centric world. Now what's happened is, with suburban sprawl, we've moved further and further. That line has grown wider between those 2 points. We're shuffling back and forth, our lives are becoming busier and frantic, and even our social structures have started to move out even further. So I'm going to ask you to fast forward now to the year 2020. It's 8 years from today. At that point in time, if we have an average economy, things are running okay, not terrible, not great, we will have roughly 164,360,000 individuals in the U.S. workforce. It's a lot of people. 53% roughly women, and 47% men. What's startling is the projections that we're starting to see, which is that 45% of the U.S. workforce will be contingent workers at that point in time. What does that mean? And that's a conservative number. What does it mean? Contingent. It means they are no longer a direct employee of a company. They are free to work wherever. This is the breaking point, or the radical shift that I think is about to happen. If half of our friends and family no longer belong to a workplace, and that is where we receive the majority of our identity, what will fill that gap for people? So we can look at this as either being apocalyptic or Renaissance. I believe it's a little bit more on the Renaissance. I think this is going to be a fascinating point in time, but it is going to be a shift that is going to happen at such a rate that will take us time to catch up to. Just stop and think about it for a minute. If you no longer have to go to the office and you can work anywhere, where will you work? And why will you work there? It will start to impact our transportation systems. It will change our schooling structure. Right now we're educating children to go into a workplace, a corporate kind of environment. It will start to impact that. It will start to change our lifestyles of where we choose to live. So where I think we're going is we're stepping back to what I would call a social-centric work environment, a collaborative work environment, where individuals will choose to work based upon who is at a space, the type of work they're doing, and all sorts of other things will start to happen. We'll start to shift our time, which is already occurring because of technology. But we'll move from place to place versus going from one location to the next. Again, this is a pretty radical shift. But if you stop for a minute and just look at this diagram, it looks familiar, right? We're going back to the nomadic work life. The only difference is now we actually have, most of us will have a home. However, if you fast forward even a little bit further, you'll start to ask, well, what does that mean? If I can work anywhere, I may be working on a project in Minneapolis, and I may come up to Fargo the following week, and I may be in Shanghai the following week. I'm going to go where the work is, or where the herd went. So this is a pretty interesting shift. The more interesting part of this shift, I think, rather than just the technical, how is this going to lay out? Where are these work centers going to happen? Will it be 45%? Will it be 50%? What I think is more interesting and something that we have to grapple with as a society is the human side of it. In our experience in running CoCo, a collaborative co-working space, we have seen time and time again new members come in, who are alone, who've been isolated, who are trying to reestablish a sense of identity. And they often carry with them the identity that they had from their last location, whether it was a job, I was a vice president of marketing at such and such company. They carry that with them. And it's a challenging journey that they go on. This brings me back to grade school again. No, I don't have bad memories of grade school. But growing up in the suburbs of Minneapolis, I went to an elementary school, K through 6. And, it was really interesting. It was a very integrated community, a fun community. We knew each other. And as we grew up, got to the top of the totem pole at 6th grade. Remember that? You're kings then, right? Until the next year hit. And it's 7th grade, first day of school, first day of lunch. And you're standing in the lunchroom with your tray, and you look out over the sea of kids. And you see some of them sitting together, some of them in cliques, some of them individually and alone. And you have a choice to make there, and you realize that your role, your work, your job at this point in time as a student, who you sit next to will start to form your identity. So you chose the best you could, as wisely as you could at that time. You see, what was happening at this moment, and what is happening and is going to replay over and over again over the next 8 years, is we're grappling with and struggling to figure out a sense of belonging. It's a critical part of this journey, moving from a dedicated work identity to an independent worker. And, Maslow had it right. He talked about our needs to have food and water first. Secondly, once we had food and water, we had security. Right after that is a sense of belonging. Without a sense of belonging, we will no longer be able to move into self-esteem, right? We won't have this identity, ability to become who we want to be. This is where I think collaborative work centers are going to step in. They're going to be communities of individuals working together, collaborating together, again, when they want to, where they want to, on different time shifts, all over the globe. This is where half of the population, half of our workforce will be working in the very near future, 8 years out. So again, I see this as not apocalyptic, but truly as a renaissance. This is a place, and this transformation that occurs allows individuals to be who they want to be, who they were meant to be. This brings me to Dave Allen. Dave Allen is one of our members at CoCo. He came to us after he sold his company, a very successful company, sold it to a larger firm, where he worked for a year and a half, dutifully packaging up and handing off his baby. You see, Dave's entire identity and his human value, everything that encompassed him, was emblazoned in that work. It's who he was. He handed that off, and he walked out the door. And he looked to go, where's next? Dave found a collaborative workplace, came in, and he walked into the door. I met him. Several of us met him and talked with him. We weren't sure he was going to make it. We didn't think he was collaborative enough. Didn't have the quite, maybe didn't look right, didn't look like what we thought a collaborative worker would look like. And shame on us. You see, we had an identity about him, Our identities are not just that which we form around ourselves, it's about what we form around others. And this world is changing. This workplace is changing. Our identities are going to change. Now, ultimately, Dave made it. That's the good story. It took him 2 tries, coming in, leaving, trying to go back to a workplace, coming back in again. And he landed. And he landed where he was truly being who he wanted to be. He was pursuing that work that was meaningful to him. But it was because he landed in a community where he could find that identity again. So Dave taught us a couple things. First of all, he taught us that collaborative communities are transformational. They change people when you join them. And I believe it's because you get to be who you want to be. There's no title, there's no name. It's only what you do that counts. That's powerful. Secondly, Dave taught us that favors are the new currency for the collaborative work environment. When we get to be human with one another, and I get to help you out, and you help me out with something, we suddenly start to build bonds. We start to build communities that are meaningful and impactful. It's really powerful stuff. So, in closing, I'd ask you to do a couple things. Number one, think about the next 8 years. This is a shift. Think about half the people you know, and remember, you may be one of them, will start to move out of your office into this kind of work environment. Secondly, I'd ask you to remember and think about your identity. And is it associated with a title, a company, or are you doing what you really passionately want to do? And are you doing it well? And are you being paid for doing it passionately, not just showing up 9 to 5? And if you're not, if you're in the latter camp, start to think about building your identity and taking steps and moving forward in that. Finally, and the most important thing, and the lesson that hit us really hard, is if you're of the 45%, 50%, and you're sitting in a collaborative workstation space, and Dave walks in the door, make room for him at the table. Thank you.